Well, hello, my friends. Hope you're doing amazing. And as always, I thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to watch this video. Now, ultimately, this video, my reaction to the Kim Potter verdict, is something that spurned out of a discussion that began in my Facebook page, Kirk's Court. And so if you follow along, if you're a member there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not, and you're a true crime fan, why aren't you there? Because we have some great discussions about true crime topics. And also, you know, if you're not a member and you follow the Kim Potter trial, I think you'll be able to follow along quite well, actually. But anyway, so last week when I heard the Potter verdict right before the holidays, my initial reaction was, and I'm going to read it to make sure I get it right, the conviction of Kim Potter makes me weep for the police and the concept of reasonable doubt. And that spurred a lot of discussion, so I thought I wanted to kind of explain what exactly I meant by all that, because it's not, you know, something you could always sum up in one sentence. So as a precursor to kind of getting my meaning, I want to make sure that I acknowledge the reality here, that I'm not blind to the reality about the thin blue wall, thin blue line, whatever you want to call it. I mean, anecdotally, throughout my career, I saw police officers lie and get away with it quite often. And, you know, there's no more prominent example, to me at least, in Phoenix than the story of Officer Richard Crimson, who planted drugs on a woman and probably made liars out of the fellow officers that were there that day, and was later caught on videotape planting the drugs on the homeless woman. Later, he wound up shooting a young man and his dog, a mentally disabled young man and his dog. And the only reason that he was ever held to account for that and ultimately convicted of second-degree murder, if I recall correctly, was that his partner turned him in. His partner broke the line, if you will. And of course, you know, I'm very well aware that that wall has existed for a long time and still does. But we're starting to see a sea change. And I always wonder when I think about these cases or look at these cases, how much the Derek Chauvins of the world, right? He's the poster boy, if you will, for policing or poor policing, how much they got away with before body cameras and before everybody had a cell phone to record every single thing. So I completely understand that when we're talking about this topic. Now, as far as, you know, my reaction to the guilty verdict, the first-degree manslaughter and the second-degree manslaughter, why I weep for police and the concept of reasonable doubt. If you follow the trial, you know that the state presented one witness, basically Mr. Stoutham, I believe it was, who testified that Officer Potter's use of force, be it a taser or a gun, was excessive and inappropriate. And he had various reasons for that related to Mr. Wright being in the car, where he was, he could have took off. And his ultimate solution, I think, was, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, was the idea that, you know, they could have got him later. And, of course, to me, that really rang hollow. Because, and it probably did with a lot of you too, right? Because the idea would be that the police, because Mr. Wright struggled, because he broke free from Officer Lucky, that the police were supposed to just let him go. Now imagine that, right? A man with an outstanding weapons warrant at the time, and a man who had an order of protection against him by a female, who had a female in the car, and you don't know, at that time, the police didn't know whether she was the subject of the order of protection. Mr. Stoutham's response was, well, let him go. You know, that just doesn't digest well with me, right? Because think about the outcry had he have done something, had she been the subject of the restraining order, had something happened to the passenger. It just doesn't fly with me. Plus, not only that, but we saw him in custody, if you will, acknowledge that he was arresting and fighting and struggling away from Officer Lucky, trying to get in the car and run away. And so it began up the question, because the expert's testimony or answer wasn't very satisfying to me, I always had the question in my mind, and probably one question that many of you had in your mind, is what was Officer Potter and the other officers supposed to do at the time of this incident? What were they supposed to do? Was no force appropriate? And that kind of gets me to the point where it makes me weep for the state of policing. Because I wonder what the officers now, who are making those stops today, be it in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, or anywhere else, what are they supposed to do in similar situations? Are they going to be worried and concerned that if they make a traffic stop and try to make a lawful arrest, I mean, this was a lawful arrest, nobody ever doubted that they might become the next Kim Potter if they have to use force? If they feel in those few seconds, and keep in mind, we're talking about a few seconds in time, right, that a use of force is necessary, are they going to hesitate to do that because they don't want to be the next Kim Potter? Not only in terms of criminal liability, but civil liability. And ultimately, that does make me weep for the state, for the police. Even though that thin blue wall is there and all those sort of things, because I wonder, what are they supposed to do? And let's face it, no matter how much we condemn, and rightly so, the Officer Chauvins of the world and some of these other senseless shootings, we do rely on our police. And we have to, as a society as a whole, in my opinion, take better care of those who care for us. And that's why it makes me weep for the police. Yes, me, a former defense attorney. But also it made me weep for the concept of reasonable doubt, the presumption of innocence, right, that we all are supposed to enjoy when we walk into a courtroom. I say that because to me this case seemed to be infused with reasonable doubt. I mean, during the state's case, they produced several witnesses, their witnesses. Major Johnson, Officer Lucky, the former chief of police whose name escapes me at the moment, all testified, and I believe one other, all testified that they believed that the use of force, the taser, was appropriate. As a matter of fact, I think a few went so far as to say that they believed that the use of a gun was appropriate in that circumstance. Now, certainly their opinions varied with the state's expert, and maybe you could go back to that thin blue wall or thin blue line, whatever you call it, and say that's why they were saying that. But I think they had pretty reasoned approaches to why, pretty good excuses why. There was no just simply blindly supporting Officer Potter. I mean, we all saw the tape, right? We all saw Officer Johnson in the car. We all saw Mr. Wright struggle. And we all are still left with that question, what would we want the police to do? And then, of course, during the defense case, we saw them put on experts. Now, they should have probably put on an expert related to, fight or flight, the panic response to these type of situations. They talked about training and use of force, et cetera, and we talked about action error. And again, ultimately then, with that evidence, viable evidence, in my opinion, and obviously the jury took some 20 plus hours, I think it was like 26 hours to reach the verdict, there was ultimately, in all of that, no proof beyond a reasonable doubt. There was reasonable doubt, I should say. And that reasonable doubt was overcome probably by a few strong-willed members of the jury. I don't know. But ultimately it does make me weep for reasonable doubt when there was so much reasonable doubt in a case and someone with her background, her stellar background, got convicted of manslaughter and second-degree manslaughter, first and second-degree manslaughter, recklessness, and culpable negligence. Now, one of the issues was brought up as, well, she's a police officer and she made a mistake, because we've heard that being a mistake. We all heard that on the tape, gun versus taser. Why shouldn't a police officer be held liable if we're held liable? Well, I think it's a little different. We, as civilians, if you will, are held criminally liable under recklessness and culpable negligence or negligence, whatever definition a state uses, based on pretty aberrant, pretty wild behavior, right? It mostly comes up, I think, in negligent homicide, when people are drunk or intoxicated in some way, driving a car and they kill someone, or they create a, imminent risk of physical harm. That's where it mostly happens. There's a few other circumstances, one that just left my brain as I was talking here. But there are a few other circumstances where that happens. But the behavior has to be so outrageous, right? You know you're intoxicated. You know you shouldn't be behind the wheel. Maybe you're you're drag racing down the street and you hit somebody, something like that. So reckless, so negligent that there's a culpability there. And to me, this isn't that, right? This is, and one of the things we heard in the trial, this is kind of the action error. It's kind of equivalent to a surgeon making a mistake, a dentist making a mistake, some kind of professional, maybe an accountant making a mistake, some kind of professional making an error, where the redress should be civil redress. Somebody mentioned in the group a wrongful death suit. Perhaps that's right. Something of that nature is more appropriate to me than a criminal conviction, given the amount of reasonable doubt that's involved in this. And again, it makes me weep for that presumption of innocence when it's not given to someone who was in the position Officer Potter was in, and who clearly does not have a history of this sort of thing, and how that was overcome. Now, of course, there's kind of the explanation of what I meant, but before I close out this video, this bordering on long-winded video, I want to make sure that none of this detracts away from my feelings that this is a complete tragedy. Dante Wright shouldn't have died. It's sad. And, if you watch the trial, you saw the heartbreaking testimony of his mother, his girlfriend, I believe she was, a passenger in the car, and his father. And that's just heartbreaking stuff, and there's no doubt about it. Nothing I say here really changes that. But my heart also breaks for Kim Potter and her family, because by all accounts, this was a police officer trying to do her best, and a woman who was full of regret. And we saw her cry on the stand. To me, authentic tears. We saw them right after on the video as well. So I hope nothing I say here I want to detract from that as well. So as I get on the border of long-windedness, I'm going to end this video. I look forward to hearing your comments. I love the discussions we have on Kirk's Court. So let me thank you all, I guess, now that we're at the end of the year, for being a member of that group. And if you're not, hope you'll join us. And until then, I look forward to seeing you in 2022, my friends. Bye now.